Welcome to this webinar regarding EPCs, which are Energy Performance Certificates, and the private rented sector. So let's have a look at the legislation that covers this and why I've chosen to do a webinar on this. So basically, we've had a change in legislation very recently, which means all properties in the private rented sector now must be an E rating. But where did this come from? So this comes originally from the Energy Act of 2011 and the Energy Efficiency in the Private Rented Property England and Wales Regulations 2015. This sets out minimum energy efficiency standards, known as MEES, that the government wants for commercially let properties. Now, although we would class rented properties as domestic, for this particular set of legislation, because rent is received from a landlord by a tenant, then this would class as a commercially let property, which is why these regulations affect domestic rented properties. And it's there to make sure that the UK's housing stock is the most efficient when it comes to energy efficient carbon reduction targets, etc., etc. And obviously the government have got its reduction in emissions. It's got to reach 57% by 2030, and that's on 1990 levels. The good news for tenants with this legislation, because they are the ones paying the bills, any works that a landlord has to do will obviously affect the tenant's bills, obviously improving heating, improving insulation, etc., etc. So let's move on to what the current regulations mean and how they affect tenancies in the private rented sector today. So the first lot of legislation actually came in on April 2018, and it stated that from April 2018, the MEES rules meant that landlords could not renew or grant a new tenancy of longer than 6 months if a property had an EPC rating of F or lower. Now, as you can see from the EPC graph on the screen, there are only a few gradings for the EPC, A to G, and it's the F and G rating that this type of legislation affects. So what they're looking at is ensuring that all properties in the private rented sector are a minimum of an E rating on the EPC scale. Now, from April 2020, this affected all tenancies in the private rented sector, and this included periodics. So we were looking at a lot of landlords not realising when they renewed their tenancies that they should have been looking at their EPC rating and how that would affect any renewal. Basically, moving forward, every property in the private rented sector should now be an E. If it isn't, then you can get an exemption, which we'll come on to later in the webinar. So this is basically a breakdown of how the legislation works for landlords and at what point you should have been checking your EPC and getting any work done if you needed it. So if your current tenancy period started before the 1st of April 2018 and runs until at least the 1st of April 2020, so we were looking at 2-year tenancies or maybe more, but it had to be in the fixed term, then you had until April 2020 to make the improvements to the property which brought it up to an E rating or register for an exemption. But if your tenancy, obviously now we're into July, if your tenancy started after the 1st of April 2018, and then you maybe had a periodic tenancy that came into force or a new tenancy that came into force after this date, you had to ensure your property was an E rating and make those remedies immediately or register for an exemption if you were able to. You need to improve the property to an E rating or register an exemption before you enter into a new tenancy or a renewed existing tenancy. What ways do properties need to apply? So basically, we're looking at the type of tenancies. Now, as standard, it's assured tenancies. So this would obviously also include assured shorthold. Regulated tenancies that started before the 15th of January 1989. So these would be classed as protected tenancies, or some might know them as Rent Act tenancies, and domestic agricultural tenancies. There are around 3.4 million private rented sector properties that have an EPC rating of D or below. and 19.4% of private rented sector households are in fuel poverty. And this is basically what those regulations are looking at improving. For the sale of a property, you would need an EPC anyway, so all properties need an EPC by law to be able to advertise them for sale or for let. And obviously an EPC is only valid for 10 years. And when you come, although you can have a tenancy with an expired EPC, when you come to remarket the property, it must be a valid renewed EPC. So EPC's recommendations for improvement. So when you get your EPC certificate, you'll have this chart on the front that we saw on the previous screen. But what you'll also need to be looking at now and paying a lot of attention to is this chart for the recommendations. It's normally on around page 3 or 4, depending on how old your certificate is. And what it will do is look at what your property needs to do to bring it up to the next level of rating. So you can see the fourth column across has got the ratings in there, so E51, D59, D60, etc. And what you need to understand, in order to get to a C76 at the bottom, you must carry out the works in the order that it has on the recommendation sheet. You can't just go straight to replace single glazing for low E double glazing and expect to be a C76. It doesn't work like that. These are cumulative. So everything you do adds on to the next, adds on to the next to eventually get you to C76. You can obviously, if you're not too far away from an E rating, speak to your domestic energy assessor and ask them if you carried out, for example, draft proofing, replacing the boiler or energy lights throughout, would that bring you up to an E and then you'd be fine? You can do that, and a lot of the domestic energy assessors will actually provide you with a report that will show you what you need to do just to bring your property up to the next banding. So you can ask for one of those as well. So it doesn't mean that you have to do every recommendation that is on the sheet, but it does mean that you'll need to do them in order to get to the next stage of your banding. So some tips with regards to the recommendations and improvements. Improvements must be done in order. Like I say, they're cumulative and therefore will only increase in rating if they're done in incorrect order. If an EPC is 5 years old or more, I would recommend getting a new EPC carried out. Simply because if you're quite close to the E rating, and say your F rating is quite close to the E, because the RDSAP, which is the software that domestic energy assessors use to formulate the EPC, obviously over the last 10-12 years has improved dramatically. It's quite possible that just an upgrade in the software could bring your EPC up to an E because it now has more information to work with. So rather than going straight ahead and probably carrying out some really expensive recommendations and improvement works, just get a new EPC done and see if that brings you up level to a new E rating. Also check if the domestic energy assessor who carried out listed anything on the EPC as assumed. A lot of domestic energy assessors, if they're given a bulk to do, like say a block of flats, for example, they will just assume that the property is as it was at build, and therefore will only assume that everything is as it was for the building regulations of that time. So if you've got a build, for example, that's a 1970s build, then the energy assessor may only just think, well, nothing additional has been done. I'll assume it's got minimal loft insulation. I'll assume it hasn't got cavity wall insulation. And therefore that will automatically mark down your property, even though you may know that the block actually has had extensive roof insulation, has had cavity wall insulation. You yourself may have installed in the flat some high energy radiators or a condensing boiler. So it's always worth checking the wording and making sure the word assumed isn't used. And if it is, then get a new EPC done and make sure that those assumed are turned into what actually is evident in the property. So penalties for non-compliance. Now, this is where it starts to get a little bit messy. As usual, it's the local authority that are here to police the legislation. There are financial penalties, and they can prosecute up to 18 months after a breach. So, you know, it's quite a long time for them to look back in the history of an EPC or a property. So some of the financial penalties will be up to £2,000 for renting a non-compliant property for less than 3 months, up to £4,000 for renting a non-compliant property for 3 months or more, and up to £1,000 for providing misleading information on an exemption register. Again, we'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a moment. Now, the interesting thing with this non-compliance penalty is that you can only get a maximum of £5,000 per property. So even though you may have breached all of the laws in regards to this, all of the regulations, the maximum the council can charge you is £5,000. But that isn't £5,000 per breach, that's £5,000 per property in total. So not a huge amount of money in the grand scheme of things, unlike some of the other legislation we've seen, which has you know, up to £30,000 fines. £5,000 isn't the end of the world, but to a small portfolio landlord, this is going to be a significant chunk of money. Now, there is a right to appeal. You can ask your local authority to review their decision, and if you still disagree with their decision on the fine or the penalties that they've put on you, you can take it to the first tier tribunal. So it doesn't just stop at the local authority, there is redress there available. Now I'm going to talk about the 5 exemptions of a E-rated rule. So as I talked about, the properties now must be a rating of E or above. However, if you've got a property that's an F or a G, then it's quite possible that you may not have to get the work done and you could look at an exemption. So we're going to walk through those now. So high cost exemption. So interestingly, the legislation has allowed landlords to cap the amount of work needing doing by giving a financial cap to the costs. So no improvements can be made because the cost of the installation, with the cheapest recommendation, would be £3,500, including VAT. Now, again, this has got to be those listed in order. And the exemption here lasts for 5 years. But interestingly, it does include any work that you have done prior to this legislation coming into force, and it takes into consideration improvements done from the 1st of October 2017. So if you've had some work done, maybe cavity wall insulation done in October 2017, but now you've had a new EPC done and you find you're still an F, the cost of that cavity wall is added into the cost of any other recommendations doing. So let's say that cost £2,000, you've now only got 1,500 left of your high cost cap. This exemption, like I say, lasts for 5 years. After that, you will either need to do the improvements or check the legislation and see if it still meets for further exemption. Now, how to register for the exemption? You'll need to prove that there is the exemption costs, so you'll need to provide additional information. You'll have to get 3 quotes from a qualified installer for purchasing and installing the cheapest recommended measures, demonstrating that the cost will exceed £3,500 including VAT, written confirmation that you are satisfied that the measures exceed £3,500. And then I'll go through in a little bit of how you actually register. I'll talk to you about the website you need to go on. Wall insulation exemption. So if the only relevant improvement to your property is cavity wall insulation, external wall insulation, or internal wall insulation for external walls, and you have obtained a written report from an expert showing you that these measures would negatively impact the fabric or the structure of the building, then you can get an exemption. So again, you'd need to provide a written copy from a relevant expert stating that the property cannot be improved to an EPCE because the recommended wall insulation measured would negatively impact the property, or the building is of which it is part of. So again, if you're looking at, say, a block of flats, and to bring your property up to an E, you would need to get cavity wall insulation. But obviously, they can't just do cavity wall insulation on your flat. They'd have to do it for the entire block. If you can get some experts to provide you written information how that would negatively impact you, then you can apply for this exemption. Third-party consent. I think this is really where a lot of landlords will look at getting an exemption. And this basically means that somebody that you need to get permission from to carry out the works is basically saying no. Now, this could be either the tenant. The tenant could just say, no, I don't want the works done. I'm not letting people in. That could be reason for an exemption. However, you need to be mindful that that only works for the current tenant. So if your tenant then moves out 3 months later and you get a new tenant, your exemption is no longer valid, and you'll need to speak to the new tenant in regards to getting the works done. Again, if they turn around and say no, you can re-register the exemption, or you can assign the exemption to the new tenant. Another thing that might happen, as I spoke about with the cavity wall insulation, is you might have a block of flats where the managing block management company just basically say no, you can't get the works done. As long as you have that documented and in writing that they have refused consent to allow you to get the works done, then you can register for this exemption. Again, this exemption lasts 5 years. Property devaluation. This probably won't be as regular or as prominent as the third-party consent, but it basically says that if the works and the improvements that are required would bring a property's value down more than 5%, then you'd need to register for the exemption. Now, you need a report from an independent RICS registered surveyor, and obviously the improvement measures, they would need to show that it would reduce that part of the building or the whole building by more than 5%. Again, it's a 5-year exemption, but because you need the RICS surveyor, it could be harder to obtain. You'd obviously need to pay for the surveyor. Is it really worth it? You'd need to check and obviously do all your due diligence in that respect. Now, this comes in 2 parts, this next one. So this is temporary exemption due to recently becoming a landlord. Now, when I first read this, I thought, well, this is going to be quite prominent because there's quite a lot of landlords that will purchase a property with a sitting tenant, and obviously you will buy the property and all of a sudden won't have a property that's an E rating, for example. It doesn't, unfortunately. So this is where a grant of lease has happened due to a contractual obligation. So that could be, for example, if somebody has superseded a lease, maybe has become a guarantor, or a former tenant who has exercised the right to obtain an overriding lease for a property. Now, all of these are under the covenants of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1995. So it would be interesting to see how many of these exemptions actually do go through and how you would prove that, because it's a lot of hoops to jump through in order to prove that you are recently become a landlord of that property. So a new lease has been deemed or created by law. A new lease has been granted under Part 2 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954, which basically is security of tenure for a business or other professional tenants. A new lease has been granted by a court order under Part 2 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954. Additional point, as of the 1st of April 2020, a person becomes a landlord on purchasing an interest in a property, and on the date of the purchase it was let to an existing tenancy. Now, this allows you to only get an exemption for 6 months after the date of becoming a landlord. So this is really important to understand, because obviously all the other exemptions that we've looked at have all been 5-year exemptions. This one is 6 months. So within that 6 months, you've still got to either get the work done to bring it up to an E, or find one of the other exemptions that meet the criteria in order for you to get the exemption done within the 6 months time frame. So that's really, really important. So again, looking at it, it seems quite an easy option. But once you start drilling down into the different landlord and tenant acts that you need to look at, and how the lease is deemed to have been created, it's possible that not a lot of landlords will be able to use this particular exemption to avoid having to do the remedial works. So how to register your exemption. So the application is online. There is an option to do it manually. There is a digital helpline that I've got at the bottom of the screen there, but it is absolutely the way to do it is online. It's extremely simple. I've helped many landlords do them. It's a 5-minute process. You can literally upload all the documents straight there and you get your exemption almost immediately. So you go on to the private sector exemption register, you create an account, you enter the postcode of the property, state the exemption type that you want to register, you upload all the documentation to support that, and the key thing to remember here is it isn't a save it and go back to situation. You have to have everything in front of you ready. Once you've started uploading, you've got to continue uploading. You can't go back and amend. And also, once your exemption has been issued, you can't then go back a few months later and amend any information in there once the data has been submitted. Like I say, it's a very quick process, and you will get your exemption certificate immediately once you've uploaded everything. The landlords that I've worked with so far, it has all been under the third-party consent. And obviously once the letter has been uploaded from a block management company or whoever it's from, then the EPC register updates their systems as well. So the one thing I'll just come on to before I finish is that there is currently a private members bill going through Parliament, which is at its committee stage in the House of Lords, and it's called the Domestic Premises Energy Performance Bill. Now, this will look at actually increasing the energy rating for a property again. So we've just had it at an E, and we've just got our properties up to scratch for that. But this will then move properties in the domestic sector to a C rating, effective from the 1st of January. Now, at the moment, it's still going through Parliament, so it's still a bill, it's not an act, it is not yet legislation. And obviously, with everything slowing down somewhat because of COVID, it's possible that this won't go through Parliament until maybe January next year, and then we'll look at it coming into force maybe April. But it is certainly something that is gathering wheels through Parliament. And the bill is mainly focused on improving heating systems and bringing properties up to a C rating. So it's worth looking at your EPC now and the works that needs to be done to bring it up to an E, and just see what else you need to do to bring it up to a C, so you are ready for when this bill comes through Parliament. Like I say, it is a bill at the moment, but it's very, very likely that this will come through, considering it's already got to the House of Lords, that it will come through, get royal assent and become law next year. So if you've got the opportunity now to get your property up to a C, I would do that so that you are ready, rather than having to go back next year and try and do additional improvements or maybe look for an exemption. Again, the exemptions might change with regards to this new bill coming through. So I would say from landlords' point of view, from a financial point of view, get your property up to a C rating ready now, and then you won't have additional work come 2021. So I'm just going to look very quickly at the funding available for landlords. Now, bearing in mind we've just had COVID and we've just had 950,000 tenants have had to sign on for universal credit. A lot of these funding schemes that will help with bringing a property up to an E rating are only available if a tenant happens to be on benefit. So use this opportunity now, while your tenants are on benefits, to access these funding schemes and get the works done with the finance from the government or from some of these other larger energy dealers. So City Energy Network is one of the larger ones providing grant funding to bring properties up to scratch. E.ON, as a utility provider, have got quite a few funds available for landlords to bring their properties up to an E rating. Here in Hertfordshire, we have Hertfordshire Warmer Homes. They have funding available, and they work with local organisations and companies to help properties get up to a good eco rating. The Green Deal Eco Energy, very different to the original Green Deal, which was scrapped. But this again is funding for landlords to bring properties up to scratch. Yorkshire Energy Services. Now I've put that in because although it says Yorkshire, it does actually cover the whole of England. So if your property meets their eligibility criteria, you can actually apply to Yorkshire Energy Services to have help in bringing your property up to the required energy rating. So some of these are actually area specific. So obviously Hert's Warmer Homes is specific to tenants on benefits in the Hertfordshire area. Now the other one that I looked at was energy company obligations, which basically looks at large energy companies have a legal obligation to help low-income families and households in underprivileged areas save money on heating and insulation. Now their website, like boilergrants.uk, make it easy for you to qualify if you're on benefits. So you can get a free boiler if your tenants are on benefits. So looking at the past legislation that I just looked at, the domestic energy bill going through Parliament, bringing things up to a C, if that's looking at heating systems and your boiler needs replacing and your tenant is currently on universal credit because of their job situation, this could be an ideal opportunity for you to be looking at grant funding based on your tenant's current situation and getting the works done through local grant funding. The link at the bottom in white, simple energyadvice.org.uk/grants, is actually a grant calculator. So when you click on that, you can put in the property address, and what it will do is bring up all the grant funding available in your area. So again, depending on where you're listening to this from, if you're further up north or if you're further down south than to Hertfordshire, you can have a look on there and it will show you all the grants available in your property area that you can apply for. But also, like I say, it's worth being mindful of using the time now that your tenants may be on universal credit before they go back into full-time employment, to ensure that you are in a situation where you can get the works done and you don't have to dip into your pocket for that. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope that's been informative. If there's anything else that you would like me to talk about, then please do let me know in the comments and I will run more webinars for you. Thank you for listening this afternoon. Bye-bye.